Okay, you've been welcomed. Well, I welcomed you, but I'll add another welcome. And I want to say it's a very, very big honor for me to introduce Professor Ricardo Otheguy tonight. As many of you know, Professor Otheguy was my professor at the CUNY Graduate Center. Before I get to the more standard part of my introduction, I want to tell you a short story that some of you might not know. While I was a student at the Graduate Center, I was studying for what was then the first comprehensive examination. It was tremendously stressful. I spoke with Professor Otheguy that summer, and I said that I was planning to drop out of the program. And in what I learned was his characteristic kindness and humanity. He calmed me down, and he convinced me not to make any decisions like that under the stress of the exam. I said, well, you know, I'm not really learning what I hope to learn about language in the program anyway, so I think it might be for the best. And he offered instead to work with me on an independent study the following semester. And it was during that time that he introduced me to Columbia School Linguistics. A whole world of new ideas opened up to me. I began attending the Friday Columbia School seminars. And with Professor Otheguy as my very supportive, though also very exacting dissertation advisor, I finished my degree, and here I am with the opportunity to give this formal introduction. As most of you do know, Ricardo Otheguy is Professor of Linguistics at the City University of New York's Graduate Center. His publications in theoretical linguistics are in the areas of Spanish linguistics, functional grammar, the Columbia School, and the Spanish of the United States. He's also published in applied linguistics in the areas of bilingual education and the teaching of Spanish to native speakers of Spanish. Professor Otheguy holds a PhD in linguistics from the City University of New York, as well as degrees and diplomas in Spanish from Louisiana State University, the City College of New York, and the University of Madrid, Spain. Professor Otheguy has participated in national and international conferences throughout the US, Europe, and Latin America, and has lectured and conducted research in universities and research centers in several countries, including Cuba, Mexico, Puerto Rico, Spain, and Uruguay. He's the author of numerous papers that have appeared in major research journals and anthologies, including a 2007 article in the journal Language with co-authors Anastasia Centella and David Liver, and a forthcoming book, really very forthcoming, from Oxford University Press with Anastasia Centella called Spanish in New York, and it's based on their National Science Foundation research project. He's also a co-author of the most widely used high school Spanish textbook in the US. Professor Otheguy is the founder and director of RISLIS, which many of you know, the CUNY Research Institute for the Study of Language and Urban Society, which conducts research on language, literacy, and bilingualism in urban contexts. He's also a founding member of the Columbia School Linguistics Society and one of its original executive board members, soon to be taking a new position of Vice President of Technology. He's a regular participant in our Friday morning Columbia School seminars, where it is well known that we all benefit from his enthusiasm for ideas, his measured and always diplomatic approach, and his insistence on clarity and precision in both thinking and writing. Today's talk extends that demand for clarity to foundational ideas that all linguists must wrestle with. I'm privileged to introduce to you Professor Ricardo Otheguy.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming today. It's indeed an honor to be one of the speakers of the new format of the Columbia School Seminar, and it is a great source of pleasure for me that I am speaking at the seminar during the year when an important event is happening in the history of this group, namely the forthcoming publication of the book by Alan Huffman and Joseph Davis that compiles all the works of William Diver. So I feel that it's great to be on the list of speakers in the same year as the publication of that book. This talk that I'm going to mostly read today is about the radical critics of linguistics, and it's a kind of meta-theoretical discussion about the place of Columbia School linguistics within the sites of that criticism. So it will be It's been written by people who already know a bit about what Columbia School is about, but I'll try to explain as I go along for those of you who don't know. These critics have always started their criticism of linguistics in general by attacking the notion of langue, the notion of the linguistic system. So I begin in number 1 on the handout with the idea that the notion of langue, the notion of a linguistic system, a linguistic structure, a grammar, is Saussure's most enduring contribution. Saussure had 2 reasons for positing the notion of a linguistic system, and one was the problem of the identity of units in diachrony, and the other one was the need to stay away from the a priori nomenclatures used in synchrony. Langue, in Saussure's work, solved those 2 problems, so that just on that account, the idea of a linguistic system has been a serious and lasting and successful contribution to linguistics. However, of late, this idea has come under very serious attack, and it is that view of Saussure as the misguided beginner of linguistics, as the misguided founder of linguistics, that I would like to talk about today. Number 2, the main characteristics of Saussure's langue was that the linguistic system was a network of oppositions. It was a web of interconnected and codependent parts. In the formulation of Antoine Meillet, many people think that Saussure said this, but Saussure never said this. In the formulation of Meillet, for Saussure, a linguistic system is a system where everything holds, where everything hangs together. A system où tout tient, said Meillet, that Saussure said. The linguistic system is all together, is self-contained, and it is a grid of interdependent parts. Saussure, as those of you who are fond of the cours know, used many metaphors to bring this point across, and the metaphors are well known. A language is like a train schedule. It all hangs together. A language is like the game of chess. It's all an interconnected set of rules. A language is like a symphony. Everything in the symphony hangs together. These metaphors were intended to support the idea of language as a discrete, holistic, integrated, single system. And this notion has been widely accepted by all linguists. For years in the Columbia School, this was also a widely accepted idea, a widely accepted view of looking at language. I've been coming up here for about 40 years now, believe it or not. And in all those years, and at least until 1995, I never heard anyone here complain about tout tient. All the prophets of this group, the ones from Argentina, the ones from the Midwest, none of them ever complained about tout tient, at least until 1995. So this idea has been for many years, at least until the publication of Diver in 1995, widely accepted even within the Columbia School. On the handout, I ask you to pause for a minute and realize how successful and how important the metaphors are to support the idea of the innumerable, discrete view of languages. Okay? If you don't know how to move pawns in the game of chess, if you don't know that they move one way but take the other way, if you don't know that rule and you move chess in some other way, you're no longer playing chess. Everything holds together and everything makes the whole have boundaries. If you don't have on your train schedule the 8:30 train to Paris that we are also fond of from the writings of Saussure, then you have a different schedule. Codependence of the parts creates the discreteness of the wholes. In other words, it is because all the parts hold together in chess, in schedules, and in language that you have discrete, single, innumerable languages. So, this idea that has been so widely accepted in linguistics, this idea of the interconnected parts of a single language are widely discussed in linguistics. So, for example, I can think of 2 very commonly repeated ideas. The idea that languages that have nominal case endings disfavor the use of prepositions, and that when they lose the case endings, they begin to have more prepositions. The idea that languages that have rich verb endings disfavor the use of subject pronouns, and if they lose the verb endings, either diachronically or synchronically, the subject pronouns come roaring in. So linguistics has been fond for a very long time of the notion of the interconnected parts creating discrete, innumerable languages. In number 6, I give you a summary. The most important consequences of tout, tient, and the supporting metaphors are that the system was different from its implementation in use, that the system was synchronically stable, like a chess game, like a symphony, independent of whether you play it or not, that the system was one. This is very important. There is only one game of chess, and that the system was discrete and separate from other systems. The game of chess is different from the game of checkers. These were the consequences of this view of linguistics. Now, consider now what the critics, what I call the radical critics of linguistics, are saying. Think about what they're saying. They're saying that there is no difference in their eyes between the tradition of Saussure and of the semiotic view of language and the tradition of Chomsky and the sentential view of language. For these people, it makes no difference. Let me remind you that in linguistics today, one of the great divides is between people such as Chomsky, who regard language as basically a computational system, a system of mechanical autonomous rules on the one hand, and then on the other hand, people like Lange, for example, and all the people who do cognitive linguistics, who regard language as basically a system of symbols, a semiotic system. Obviously, in that divide, Columbia School is, together with cognitive linguistics, a view of language where language is symbolic, language is semiotic. So if you take that great divide, what you have is that the critics of linguistics are saying, the two of you think that you're very different, that you are very different from each other. The Lange and Columbia say there are no syntactic autonomous rules of syntax. There is no such thing. The syntacticians are saying, well, the symbolic part of language is really very unimportant. It is the computational system that's at the heart of it. The critics of linguistics are saying the house of Saussure is as misguided as the house of Chomsky. They are both completely wrong. So, from the point of view of these colleagues of ours, never has it been more true that they wish a pox on both our houses. We're all wrong. We have it totally wrong. In number 8, I give you a summary of the criticisms of linguistics that these colleagues of ours give. And they mean the criticism to be of any linguistics that posits an underlying system. Any linguistics like Chomsky's that has a grammar. Any linguistics like Saussure and its descendants, as they see them, that has a linguistic system which is also a grammar. So any linguist that posits an underlying single system is going to become grist for the mill of these critics. And let's see why. Criticism 1. Saussure's linguistic system has legitimized the fallacious, invented, discrete, innumerable language. This is sin number 1. Because of the presence of Saussure and what the followers of Saussure have done, they have given solace, they have legitimized this idea of which they consider fallacious, that there are discrete things like English and Arabic and Swahili and French and Spanish. This is a very bad idea, and it is a fault that can be laid at the feet of Saussure. Okay? The criticism is, and I'm in Roman 8, criticism 1, the criticism is that the notion of the stable, synchronic, tout tient system has served as a conceptual bridge to the social invention of singular, countable languages. Linguistics, and more specifically Saussure and Chomsky and their followers, have aided and abetted the perpetration of a mistake, and in some cases a grievous offense. This mistake that we should think that there are discrete languages. So, If you don't know, now you know. There is a whole trend of scholarship led by people like Roy Harris, the translator of Saussure, like Simfrey Maconey, like Alistair Pennycook. These people have been saying very eloquently that linguistics is completely wrong and that one of its big mistakes is to think that these social creations called languages by society are in some way also mental realities and innumerable different languages. They of course recognize the social invention, but they think this is a wrong way to think about languages, and they lay that at the feet of Saussure and all his followers, including Chomsky and Lange and Columbia School and everybody. Okay, some quotes. When we argue that languages are constructed, we seek to go beyond the obvious point that linguistic criteria are not sufficient to establish the existence of a language, the old language-dialect boundary debates, in order to identify the important social and semiotic processes that lead to their construction. Maconey and Pennycook. Romain, a very conservative, sedate, careful thinker, Suzanne Romain, she reminds us the very concept of discrete languages is probably a European cultural artifact fostered by procedures such as literacy and standardization. There is no real linguistic reality to languages. These are cultural artifacts. Maconey and Pennycook make the interesting point that ethnologue recognizes 7,000 different languages in the world. But ethnologue also points out that they know of 40,000 names for languages in the world. So somehow the European writers, with the point of view, have somehow eliminated 33,000 terms from the list. Also from Maconey and Pennycook, at the heart of the problem here is the underlying ideology of countability and singularity, reinforced by assumptions of a singular, essentialized language object. So they say this is a cultural artifact which is reinforced by linguistics. Criticism number 2. Saussure's linguistic system is behind the fallacious, invented, discrete, innumerable dialects or varieties of a language. The concept of a language, as in Saussure, now look at this list by another group of critics, Thorne and Landolf. The concept of a language, as in Saussure, Bloomfield, and Chomsky, reifies mutable, local, and contingent communicative repertoires into categorical linguistic varieties. So what they're saying is that Saussure, Bloomfield, and Chomsky, they're all the same, have taken these very contingent, local, mutable repertoires and reified them into these categories known as dialects. So Saussure's integrated, discrete, single linguistic system is thus seen as contributing to the enduring currency of the notion of the dialect despite its many critics. So even though there have been lots of criticisms beginning with Saussure of the notion of dialect, it is in fact the very idea of langue proposed by Saussure and his followers that reifies the notion of the dialect. Saussure's langue, the linguistic system, along with all contemporary linguistics, excludes communication and people. Along with Bloomfield and Chomsky, Saussure is responsible for what Fauconnier and Turner called the unfortunate triumph of form in linguistics. Saussure, Bloomfield, and Chomsky see language as a natural object, independent of lived communicative activity. So people are nowhere in the mental grammar of Saussure and the mental grammar of Chomsky in the linguistic system. And they say, for Saussure, meaning resides within language. Meaning is transparently encoded and transmitted in linguistic signs themselves rather than in concrete material human activity. So the language has meaning in it. It is not humans that are doing language. Some quotes. Saussure is thus essentially the same as the tradition and the same as Chomsky. Meaning invested in signs is ultimately like meaning contained in the truth conditions of sentences. And then they have some people that they like. And they say, as opposed to Saussure, Bloomfield, and Chomsky, Wittgenstein got it right. Meaning does not reside in an abstract underlying sentence. For Wittgenstein and others who got it right, quote, an utterance is the starting point for a complicated process of interpretive inference rather than something which can be treated as self-subsistently intelligible. Also in the same criticism, the exclusion of communication and people makes it impossible, under the prevailing conception of language, to study the impact of language on society and politics. Quote, contemporary linguistics makes it difficult to see that language shapes and is shaped by enduring conceptual properties of the social, political, and material world. I put this under criticism number 4 because some of you have, I think, misread, not youth, young people, some of the older people here, have misread the criticism by Marconi and Harris and all these other folks as being a purely political one. It is not. I'm trying to show you that they have, in fact, a criticism that is aimed at all of us, not simply at those of us who may be interested in political questions. Criticism 4, Saussure's linguistic system is inherently stable and shapes variable use, whereas in fact, it is use that shapes an inherently unstable system. So these critics are saying that the view of language that has been perpetrated since Saussure is that the mental grammar facilitates speech, makes it possible, shapes speech, gives form to it, when in fact they say it's the other way around. It is usage that gives shape to the grammar. And criticism 5, and the one that I think it is more a greater interest to me, but that doesn't mean that it's a more important one. Criticism 5, the last one, Saussure's linguistic system makes it impossible to understand the linguistic competence of the majority of the world's speakers who are said to be bilingual or multilingual and whose speech appears most of the time to be a switching mix of linguistic resources. So the criticism is that because of the Saussurean law and all its ramifications throughout linguistics, there has been created this class of unusual people who are to be remarked about, books should be written about them, courses should be taught about them, namely people who are bilingual or multilingual, and who have a very strange habit of mixing these things that are in fact, that should be, according to the Saussure ideology, separate and discrete. And these people do not seem to respect that and create this mishmash of linguistic resources. A quote from another important critic, Blumert. He says, in this book, 2010, just to show you that I'm giving you the recent stuff, the localism, in this book, the localism that is central to much discourse on linguistic rights and linguistic imperialism will be examined and opposed to a sociolinguistics of mobile resources. The frame I offer is based on mobility and on actual bits of language. This is a man who is studying things like the 300 languages that are spoken in a city like London and the probably 500 that are speaking in a city like New York, where people from Africa go home and speak in the resources of their original land. When they go to the school speaking what the society calls English, when they go to the call center which is owned by Pakistanis, they communicate in the language of the Pakistanis. And these are people who use pieces of language to make their life. And this is what interests him. This is what he calls mobile resources, actual bits of language. I thus propose a view of truncated multilingualism, repertoires composed of specialized but partially and unevenly developed resources. We never know all of a language. We always know specific bits and pieces of it. So I've given you the 5 criticisms. Now you're going to say, well, what exactly is the problem? I'll tell you. Here's what the problem is. The prevailing conception of grammar, attributed to Saussure, Chomsky, and all their followers, namely all of linguistics, is seen as highly compatible with the socially defined, single, discrete, innumerable language, the innumerable dialects the stable, autonomous, people-less language, and the view of multilinguals as a special class of speakers. All of this is wrong. And yet, linguistics is highly compatible with all these views. This is what they're saying. The prevailing conception of grammar as an integrated system is thus a facilitator, an accomplice, a co-conspirator. These views of language, which these critics see as being all wrong, were not created by linguistics, but it is linguistics that is given them legitimacy. So the linguist is a co-conspirator in creating all these fallacies that I have been listing here. One way in which I say it is that the notion of the singular, all parts interconnected, tout, tient grammar gives aid and comfort to the enemy in the view of these people. The single grammar of the linguist aids and abets a set of related beliefs that are both false and pernicious, and that are thus addressed to the sedate, removed from the phrase seeker of coherent linguistic theories, no less than to the politically engaged linguist. This, I want to stress, the criticisms that many of you have dismissed as simply coming from folk who are interested in politics and language, it's not true. The criticism is addressed both to the engaged linguist, the activist who wants to solve the linguistic problems of the world, but it is also directed to the most sedate armchair linguist. Why? Because what they're saying is that the notion of the single grammar has been an accomplice in the creation of the single language. The innumerable grammars contribute to the idea of the innumerable languages, and that this is pernicious. Well, if it were pernicious only, you could say, well, look, that's not my business. I'm not interested in what's bad for the world. I'm not interested in what's bad for society. I'm only interested in what's true about languages. These guys are saying those things are not true, so they concern you as well. They do not concern just the engaged linguist. And just to review them one last time, here are the bad things. Language is disconnected from community. These are the bad things that the Saussurean conception of the single system has helped to legitimize. These things were not started by linguists, but linguists have given them legitimacy. Language is disconnected from communication. Language is disconnected from people. Language makes it therefore impossible to study values expressed in language. Language is stable and shapes use. Languages are discrete, singular, and innumerable. Languages are divided into discrete, singular, and innumerable varieties. Multilinguals are unusual language users engaged in producing a mishmash. Now comes Columbia Linguistics. Okay. So I am now raising the question. And I have to stop because I can now go despite the... See, I'm getting rid of yes, Vice President for Communication is just what I need to do. So let's now see, with this in mind, the question that I think needs to be asked around this table. Namely, how do these criticisms affect Columbia School? Is Columbia School, which is in the eyes of many people, the Saussurean linguistics par excellence, is Columbia School the target of these criticisms? Is Columbia School different in some ways? What is the situation? I think you know what the answer is, but I will keep it secret. Number 10, the radical critics on Bulgarian linguistics. Davis, 2004, distinguishes between a Saussurean linguistics and a Diverian linguistics. Davis says Columbia School it's not a continuation of the Geneva School, but a rebellion against it. So, first thing is that in the eyes of many people at this table, I don't mean the prophets of bygone years when I first began to come to Columbia School, when Garcia and Diver then were quite happy to be Saussurean, tout, tient, linguistic systems that are discrete kinds of people. But the next generation, among them Joseph Davis, have said that Columbia School, in fact, is not Saussurean at all. So right there is a complete saying, those criticisms belong to them, not to Columbia. This is not a Saussurean school, therefore those criticisms don't apply to Columbia School. This raises several questions. Are the radical critics right in encompassing all of linguistics, lumping together Saussure, Bloomfield, above, Chomsky. You saw several quotes. Did Columbia School in its origins overcome these criticisms? Does Columbia School overcome these criticisms now? So, I want to raise the question in number 11 of whether there is a response to the critics from Diver, Davis, Huffman, and Reed. So I've been reading some of these folks, some of them the younger generation, some of them the prophets of old who still linger with their long beards and their graying cassocks. It turns out that the following is the case. The position taken in the publications by Diver, Huffman, and Reed amount to saying there is no tout, tient, there is no tout, tient language, or better, there is no language at all. Or if there is, it is not what Saussure, Chomsky, Bloomfield, and you think. That is what we're going to see. That in the eyes of Davis, because he says that the school is not Saussurean, and especially in the writings of Diver, Huffman, and Reed, there is no tout, tient language, as if I understand their writings. There is no tout en soi language. There is no language that holds together, okay, and that you can then separate Spanish from Arabic and French and so forth, because there is no language at all, okay? Davis 2004 says that Diver is not a Saussurean. Diver 1995 says that there is no evidence for the notion of language. Huffman 2006 rejects the idea of Saussure long, and Reed 2006, and we will take a little time with that, accepts long but equates it not with the large total integrated system, but with the small individual grammatical system. So let's see how those things play out. I read you some of your words. So we can now read Roman 12 in their own words. Diver 1995. There is no language existing out there. There's no language existing out there in the sense of some ideal construct, which is the job of the learners to learn and analysts to analyze. The learner, rather, seems to create what may be fairly called, it's a thank you, individualized techniques of communication, more or less on the model of what can be observed in the behavior of others. Fairly called, right?
I think
this
it may be called fairly individualized techniques.
What may be called, fairly individualized techniques of communication. I'm sorry, apologies for the misquote. This has as a consequence a lack of anything even approaching absolute uniformity from individual to individual. So what Diver would say, if I had quoted him right, is that there is no evidence that there is anything called a language out there that it is your job to analyze, okay? What there is individualized techniques of communication. And as a consequence of this, we have no reason to believe that one individual approaches uniformity with another individual. So that what the society calls the speakers of the same language, Diver says, I have no reason to believe that the people who are said to both speak French or both speak English or both speak Spanish have anything like the same individual linguistic resources. That's what he's saying. So now think of what that does to the critics. Okay. Now the way Huffman puts it, and we can ask him if I misquote. Saussure's theory of language is an a priori speculation, not a theory. The notion of long did not emerge from a body of successful analyses, and until one can say what precisely is in long, the actual signifiers and signifiers, one is not in a position to assert that there exists any long at all. So you cannot set out to construct a theory of language, because there is nothing there to construct a theory of. Now Reed, I'm going to spend a little bit more time with this idea because I think it can be very useful in addition to the others. You can see that these points by Diver, Huffman, and Davis are in fact exempting Columbia School from the radical critics. Okay, I think you'll see it, but I'll show it to you step by step. Reed 2006 says, diverse early discoveries allowed linguistic structure to be reconceived as a collection of discrete subsystems rather than as a single supersystem. The discovery of grammatical systems led Diver to revise the Saussurean notion of long from that of a single, highly integrated sign system to a heterogeneous assembly of structurally independent subsystems, along with a largely unstructured collection of lexical items. So, for those of you who are not familiar with Columbia School, what people do around this table when they're not having these public seminars is on Fridays they get together and they publish all this stuff and they write these papers that are the result of getting together and doing analyses of individual grammatical systems. An individual grammatical system may be the tense system, the number system, and so forth. And what Wally is saying in this quote is that each of these systems is independent. There is no language. There is simply a collection of grammatical systems. That's all that you can say from the point of view of the linguist. Okay? Now, some of the more familiar grammatical systems, I give you a list. For example, and for those of you who may not know, these grammatical systems are not based on pre-existing categories. They're not based on the terms of the tradition. They are the substance of these systems, the semantic substance of these systems is discovered by the analyst. And so, for example, we are now in the middle of a piece of research by a student at the Graduate Center who is studying the forms that are called the future and the periphrastic future and the present tense in Spanish. And she's discovering that these forms have nothing to do with time, nothing to do with future, and nothing to do with present. And that in fact what's involved is a system of certainty. So the substance of the systems has to be discovered by the linguist. And you study one system at a time. And the quote from Reed says that these separate systems are really separate, that there is no need and no evidence that they form anything like a whole, if I understand what Wall is saying correctly. So in number 13, a list of some of the more familiar grammatical systems, familiar to people who work around this table. The time system, the number of entities system, the differentiation system. That's the system that distinguishes between the table, a table, and table, or the milk, a milk, and milk. The kind of differentiation system, that distinguishes between he left the broken house and he left the house broken. The degree of control system, that is the system that allows speakers to figure out which participants in an utterance have more control over the event than others. And it is interesting because it is a system whose signals are positions of words rather than morphology.
These are not
So either. That's true. And we can come back to that. Yes? Item 14 then says that we need to think about Columbia School, and we have to think about what I have called here a disaggregated linguistics. Okay? A disaggregated linguistics, following Wally's line of thought, is like this. In the disaggregated linguistics of Columbia School, the competence underlying acts of speaking is not one. There isn't one grammar, but many pieces of grammar. Speech is enabled by grammatical systems A, B, C, D. There is no reason to expect that the same collection of systems is found in all speakers. What do you mean in all speakers? You mean in different languages? I thought we just went through this. There are no languages, right? So what do we mean by in all speakers? Well, there's no reason to expect that all speakers in the world will have the same system. And there is no reason to expect that all speakers in what the society calls the same language will all have the same systems. So in what society calls English, French, Bulgarian, or Arabic, there is inside of what those speakers who identify anthropologically and culturally as speakers of French, there's no reason to believe that they all have the same collection of grammatical systems. They may or they may not. Okay? So, speech is enabled by grammatical systems A, B, C, D. There's no reason to expect that the same collection of systems is found in all speakers. In this conception, speaker 1 may have A, C, and D, but not B. That's a mistake, but a typo, but not B. The speaker 2 may have A, B, C, but not D, and so on and so forth. Here's Reed's way of saying it. Each of the grammatical systems of, for example, English, and now we will come around to asking Wally what that is. But each of the grammatical, and so if I may paraphrase, each of the grammatical systems found in speakers of what are culturally known as speakers of English is shared by an indeterminate group of speakers. It is not necessary to posit or assume the existence of a single community of speakers who share the same collection of grammatical systems and lexical items as a totality, i.e. who speak the same language, in order to do linguistic analysis. Compare that to Diver, who says this has a consequence, a lack of anything even approaching absolute uniformity from individual to individual. In other words, the quote by Diver that we saw before, and we should close that parenthesis. So here's now something for me to see if I can make sense of this. For example, some speakers have a system of degree of control, a system of kind of differentiation, and a system of focus number. And they say things like, I leave the house painted, I leave the painted house. He leaves the house painted, he leaves the painted house. So behind those utterances, the linguist recognizes a system of control. That is what is guiding the placement of he and house. He is before the verb, house is after the verb. That's the control system at work. There is a system of kind of differentiation. That's what makes those speakers distinguished and understand as different the painted house, leaving the painted house, and leaving the house painted. And there is a system of focus number that makes those speakers say, I leave, he leaves. Okay? Now, all right, there may be other speakers who have, so others have control and kind of differentiation, but no focus number. So there'll be speakers who say, I leave the house painted, I leave the painted house, and who say, he leaves the house painted, he leaves the painted house. You with me? So there'll be speakers who have the idea that you place the higher controller before the verb and the lower controllers after the verb. Both of them have this notion of the control system to place he and house. And they have the same idea that of the kind of differentiation system that distinguishes painted house from house painted. Well, one of them has I leave versus he leaves, and the other one has I leave, he leaves, and does not make that distinction. So in the speech that surrounds us, we see speakers who are said by the society to speak the same language, but who in fact don't share the grammatical systems. Second example I give you, some speakers have an entity number system where 0 means 1 and S means more than 1. 1 dog, 5 dogs, 5 dogs. Others just have a lexical item that means more than 1, will have no system and no 0. 1 dog, 5 dog. So different people may have different systems. And this is, I couldn't find a reference for this, so I'm just telling you that this is what Wally told me. That's what three-person communication means. Now think of this in number 15. What makes it possible to have a disaggregated linguistics like that of Columbia School? Well, I give you letters because I want to go through it slowly. What allows this thinking in Reed of a disaggregated linguistics where all you have is independent linguistic systems that do not add up to a language. First, the integrated and discrete grammar of the innumerable language of the tradition is forced on the analyst by two theoretical decisions. In other words, the people who have the integrated system have been cornered into that by the idea that meaning is compositional and that compositional meaning is the meanings of sentences. The sentence is the theoretical pathway to the integrated discrete grammar, or tout, tient. The meaning of what happens is that the meaning of the sentence has to be contained in or interpreted through many constructs that hang together and act in unison. In other words, it is because you have sentential meaning and because you have sentences that you need theoretical constructs that operate together. The merging of noun phrase elements and verb phrase elements, all of those things have agreement, all of those categories that exist in the other traditions and that do not exist in Columbia School can be dispensed with in Columbia School because the Columbia School linguist dispenses with compositional meaning and dispenses with sentences. So, C, consider again Saussure's famous dictum. The linguistic system is a self-contained whole and a principle of classification. Okay? Un tout en soi est un principe de classification. Diver rejected the first part of this, but took to heart the second one. Diver left behind the tout en soi, but held on to the injunction against nomenclaturism contained in the dictum that a language is the principle of classification. In other words, what we see is that the only way that Reed found his way to these disaggregated linguistic systems is because in the Columbia grammar there are no a priori categories. The categories of the tradition are not taken in, and the main category that is not taken in is that of the sentence and all the appurtenances of the sentence. So there are no parts of speech, there are no subjects, there are no predicates, there's no agreement. And once you dispense with those, you dispense with the need to have an integrated whole, because it is sentential syntax that forces you to have these integrated tout, tient system. Diver was able to reject the sentence and the unavoidable implications of an underlying mesh-like grid whose elements had to hang simultaneously together. This is what allowed Reed to posit the disaggregated grammatical system. E. A key characteristic of a disaggregated linguistics like Columbia's is the distinction between meaning, which is found in grammatical systems, and message partials, which are found in utterances, including sentences. So, the key to doing what I think Wall is trying to do is the distinction between the notion of meaning, which in Columbia is not in sentences, it is not observable. Meaning is in the language. What you then do is you, as in the Wittgenstein quote, you infer messages from those meanings. F, the disaggregated reading systems are not theoretically dependent on one another. They are not rules that work in tandem to generate sentences inside competence. Okay? The disaggregated reading systems only come together in the use of language. And since each speaker can have a different set of systems, they come together differently in the different instances of use by different speakers. Romans 16, what does a disaggregated linguistics say to the radical critics? Remember criticism 1? Saussure's linguistic system has legitimized the invented discrete enumerable language. Now, what I want to say in A is that the criticism is not overcome by simply recognizing that discrete enumerable languages are socially defined entities. Even if one recognizes this, as long as one's conception of grammar is compatible with a discrete language, one is subject to the criticism. So in other words, you cannot have a linguist who says, oh, come on, I know that languages are socially defined. You're not telling me anything new. Yeah. No, what these critics, I think, are saying is that, for example, the criticism is not overcoming the generativist tradition by saying that one is studying grammars, not languages, a well-known position by Chomsky. The I-language grammars of Chomsky are integrated tout, tient grammars that continue to abet the notion of the discrete enumerable language, even if one confines them to the status of e-language. Generativists, cognitivists, and other forms of grammar are highly compatible with the socially defined discrete language because they conceive of the language as having a single integrated grammar that meshes well with the single integrated language of the social definition. Okay? So B, this criticism thus applies to Saussure and to other forms of integrated linguistics, because they all give comfort to those who adopt a discrete enumerable language. They provide a compatible linguistic model to the socially defined language. See what I'm saying? It is not simply to say, oh, I know that language is socially defined. As long as your theory of language is compatible with the social idea of a single language, in fact, what linguistics is doing is legitimizing those notions. C, the only way to overcome the criticism is to have a conception of grammar that is explicitly incompatible with the notion of the discrete language. We need a clash, not an acknowledgement. Okay? D, in Columbia School, there is no single grammar, but an assembly of grammatical systems that are disaggregated. The disaggregated conception of underlying grammars, not grammar, each system is a grammar. The disaggregated conception of underlying grammars directly clashes with the social definition of the single discrete language. This disaggregated conceptualization of Columbia School thus overcomes this criticism. And I say that maybe others do as well. But you see, you cannot do, as linguists will often do, faced with those critics who say it is your fault that we have this conception of the innumerable language. You cannot simply say, I know. I know that languages are socially defined and that there's no linguistic entity such as Igbo or Swahili or French. I know that those things are socially defined. I'm okay. Your criticism is not about me. No, I think what one has to understand is that as long as the grammar that you produce is compatible with those enumerated discrete views, linguistics is in fact subject to that criticism. Okay? The only way to not be subject to the criticism is to have a linguistic theory that is directly in clash with that view. And it is this disaggregated view proposed in Columbia School by Wally and by the others that I think is directly in clash with it. Criticism 2, Saussure's linguistic system is behind the fallacious invented discrete enumerable dialects. Okay? And I'm going to say the same thing. Okay? It is not enough to say, I know dialects are socially defined. No, you have to have a theory that clashes with the idea of dialects. Because what do we have? Well, under A, I have indented there. Saussure criticized the notion of dialect in principle. Others, Saussure did. There is a chapter in which Saussure says dialect don't make sense. Others have offered detailed, stronger critiques. In the Spanish tradition, there is a terrific paper by Orlando Alba, and he describes the search for the dialects of Spanish as una tarea vana e imposible, okay? A vain and impossible task. Yet the dialects live on. Why? Well, because the conception of the single discrete grammar allows one to conceive of the dialect as simply a smaller language. What you need is a theory that is in a direct clash with the notion of the discrete dialect, and that is only provided by this disaggregated approach. Criticism 3, Saussure's the linguistic system, along with all contemporary linguistics, excludes communication and people. In Columbia linguistics, this criticism, I think, is easily overcome because it is an integral part of the conception of language in Columbia School that you need the human being to infer messages from meanings. It is not enough because meanings are not in sentences. Meanings are not in truth conditions of sentences. Meaning is simply in the language as the meaning of individual forms, and the only way you communicate is because people, as in the quote by Wittgenstein, have to intervene to infer messages. So it is not enough to meet this criticism by saying, come on, I know people talk languages, right? No, you have to have a grammar that requires people in order to work. The architecture of your grammar has to have people. Criticism 4, Saussure's linguistic system is inherently stable and shapes variable use, whereas in fact it is use that shapes the inherent unstable system. And here you'll be happy to know that I'm not sure what to say. Okay? This situation is not as clear. The assembly approach to disaggregated grammatical systems may be an answer to this criticism.
Where are you?
Criticism 4, page 10.
Oh, all right.
So criticism 4, Wally woke up when I told him that I wasn't sure. If I'm sure, he doesn't want to hear it. Which is all very sensible because I'm only sure of the things that I've learned from Wally. So this I'm not sure about. Okay? So if these critics are right, the linguistic capabilities must be seen as inherently unstable. The grammatical systems under Reed's conception may provide the detachable, reconstitutable pieces that the critics require. In other words, these critics say that stability itself is a myth. That linguistic, even if you say that Columbia School has overcome all the prior criticisms, it does not overcome this one because Columbia School grammars these disaggregated linguistic systems that Wally wants to think about. They're still stable in some way, and these critics want linguistic knowledge to be made up of an ever-shifting quicksand. So I don't know about criticism 4, but let's see about criticism 5, which is the last thing I'm going to say. Saussure's linguistic system makes it impossible to understand the linguistic competence of the majority of the world's speakers whose speech appears to be a switching mix of linguistic resources. Remember that guy who wanted bits and pieces? Blummer, who wanted bits and pieces of knowledge? Well, if you want bits and pieces, talk to me. In other words, what the critics are saying in this 5th part is that by having discrete languages which are supported and legitimized by the discrete grammars of the Saussurean, Chomskyan general tradition, one makes it impossible to understand the behavior of bilinguals. Because bilinguals, from the point of view of grammars defined by the society, do not seem to ever be speaking in one language. They are, unless they are under highly controlled, educated settings, such as now, where I'm inhibiting myself from using more than half of my linguistic resources. Except for those cases, bilinguals seem to be talking in what appears to be a mismatch. But of course, the mismatch comes from the theory that says that languages are discrete. If you don't have discrete languages, then the behavior of bilinguals becomes exactly what you would expect. They're using one system from here, one from this land, not from this language, but from this place that they grew up in, another system from this other place, and the mishmash is no longer a mishmash. It is, in fact, now the case that bilinguals are the same as monolinguals. They are all doing the same thing. They have in their minds collections of grammatical systems, and they draw on them to communicate. Sometimes they regulate their behavior by social constraints, sometimes they don't. But I think that the disaggregated linguistics of Columbia School does offer a solution to this problem that these critics are very keen on, because many of them work in multilingual settings, that the tradition makes it impossible for one to make sense of what is going on with bilinguals. More important, that the tradition creates the bilingual. The bilingual, you see, is not a natural occurrence in the world. In the eyes of many of these people, the ones who have thought as clearly as, at least as I think I have, in the eyes of these people, bilinguals and monolinguals are doing exactly the same thing. They have no languages. All they have is collections of linguistic resources. They have Columbia grammatical systems in their minds, and they deploy them as they see that the audience needs. So I think that out of the 5 criticisms, except for number 4, which I am not sure about, I think Columbia School Linguistics overcomes them all. And in that sense, Columbia School Linguistics, perhaps Davis was right, and perhaps it is not a Saussurean school at all, because it is not subjectable to the criticisms that these critics have made of Saussure and of the entire tradition. And I thank you for your patience.